In the beginning, there was dust. Not the dust you might find settling on a bookshelf, but cosmic dust, particles of iron and silicon, oxygen and carbon, drifting through the cold darkness of space. These particles had been forged in the hearts of dying stars, scattered across the void when those ancient suns exploded in silent fury, billions of years before our story begins. 4.6 billion years ago, in a quiet corner of the Milky Way galaxy, this dust began to gather. Gravity, that patient and inexorable force, pulled the particles together, slowly at first, then with increasing certainty. The cloud of dust and gas began to spin, contracting as it turned, growing denser at its center. At the heart of this swirling disk, temperatures rose, pressure mounted. The hydrogen atoms packed so tightly together that they began to fuse, and in that moment, our sun was born. The newborn star ignited, flooding the disk around it with light and heat for the first time. But the sun did not consume all the material in that ancient cloud. Much remained, still circling, still gathering. In the disk around the young sun, the process of accumulation continued. Dust grains stuck to one another, forming pebbles. Pebbles collided and merged into boulders. Boulders became mountains of stone tumbling through space. Over millions of years, these growing bodies swept up more and more material from their orbital paths, carving clean lanes through the dusty disk. Some of these planetesimals, as astronomers call them, grew large enough that their own gravity pulled them into spherical shapes. They became protoplanets, infant worlds still forming, still gathering mass, still being hammered by constant collisions with their smaller neighbors. One of these protoplanets would become Earth, but the early Earth was nothing like the world we know. Imagine a sphere of molten rock, glowing red and orange in the darkness of space. The surface, if you could call it that, was an ocean of liquid stone. Temperatures exceeded 1,200 degrees Celsius. There was no solid ground, no water, no air that any living thing could breathe. This was the Hadean Eon, named after Hades, the ancient Greek underworld. It is a fitting name for this hellish period of Earth's infancy. The young planet was under constant bombardment from asteroids and planetesimals, still wandering through the inner solar system. Each impact released tremendous energy, adding to the heat that kept the surface molten. Deep within this ball of liquid rock, a transformation was taking place. The heaviest elements, particularly iron and nickel, began to sink toward the center. Lighter materials, rich in silicon and oxygen, floated toward the surface. This process, called differentiation, created the layered structure that Earth still possesses today, a dense metallic core surrounded by a thick mantle of heavier rock, topped by a thin crust of lighter minerals. The ions sinking to Earth's core released even more heat through friction. The planet was a crucible, separating and sorting its ingredients by density. The core, growing at the center, would eventually begin to solidify at its very heart, though its outer portions would remain liquid. This liquid metal, swirling and convecting, would one day generate the magnetic field that protects our world from the sun's harmful radiation. Then, approximately 4.5 billion years ago, something remarkable happened. A protoplanet roughly the size of Mars, which scientists have named Theia, was on a collision course with the young Earth. The two worlds had formed in similar orbits around the Sun, and gravitational interactions with other growing planets had destabilized Theia's path. The impact, when it came, was beyond imagination. Theia struck Earth at an oblique angle, hitting with such force that both bodies were partially vaporized. Rock turned to gas. The temperature spiked to tens of thousands of degrees. Material from both planets was blasted into space, forming a ring of debris around Earth. Over time, measured in centuries and millennia, This ring of vaporized and molten rock began to coalesce. Gravity pulled the particles together, and they formed a new body, our moon. The moon was born hot, possibly even molten itself, and it hung much closer to Earth than it does today, appearing perhaps 15 times larger in the sky. The impact with Theia had another profound effect. It tilted Earth's axis of rotation. To this day, our planet spins at an angle of approximately 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane around the Sun. This tilt would eventually give us our seasons, the cycle of summer and winter that has shaped the evolution of life. After the moon-forming impact, Earth slowly began to cool. The period of heavy bombardment continued, but the largest collisions were behind us. The surface, though still frequently struck by asteroids, began to solidify. The ocean of molten rock developed a crust, a thin skin of solid minerals floating on the churning mantle below. This early crust was not stable. It would melt and reform repeatedly as impacts broke it apart and volcanic activity resurfaced it. But gradually, over tens of millions of years, patches of solid ground persisted for longer and longer periods. The oldest minerals we have ever found, tiny crystals of zircon discovered in Western Australia, date back to approximately 4.4 billion years ago, proof that solid rock existed even in the Hadean. These ancient zircons tell us something else, something surprising. Their chemical signatures suggest that liquid water may have existed on Earth's surface far earlier than scientists once believed. The crystals appear to have formed in the presence of water, implying that even during the Hadean Eon, during this time of fire and bombardment, water may have gathered in low places on the surface. Where did this water come from? The answer is not entirely certain, and scientists continue to study the question. Some water was likely present in the minerals that formed Earth, released through volcanic outgassing as the planet's interior heated and melted. When volcanoes erupted on the young Earth, they released not only molten rock, but also gases, water vapor, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, sulfur compounds. These volcanic gases began to accumulate around the planet, forming the first atmosphere. It was not an atmosphere that any modern creature could survive in. There was little to no free oxygen. Carbon dioxide dominated, along with nitrogen, water vapor, and various toxic compounds. The air pressure may have been much higher than today, the sky likely a hazy orange or reddish color rather than blue. As the surface continued to cool, the water vapor in the atmosphere began to condense. Rain fell on the hot rocks, but at first it simply evaporated again, returning to the sky. The surface was still too hot for water to remain liquid for long, but Earth was slowly, inexorably cooling. Heat radiated into space. The bombardment from space debris gradually decreased as the planets swept their orbital zones clear. Eventually, perhaps around 4.2 billion years ago, though the exact timing remains uncertain, the surface temperature dropped below the boiling point of water. When this happened, the rain that fell no longer immediately evaporated. It pooled in the low places, the depressions and impact craters that scarred the surface. It may have rained for thousands of years, perhaps longer. The sky released its burden of water, and that water settled into the basins of the early Earth. The first oceans were born. They were not the blue oceans we know today. The water was likely clouded with dissolved minerals, possibly greenish or grey in colour. The ocean floor was fresh volcanic rock, still warm from the planet's heat. Underwater volcanoes erupted frequently, adding more water and gases to both ocean and atmosphere. Some scientists believe that additional water arrived from space during this time. Comets, which are essentially dirty snowballs of ice and rock, occasionally struck Earth. Each impact delivered water from the outer solar system, possibly adding to the volume of our growing oceans. Asteroids too, especially those from the outer asteroid belt, may have contained significant amounts of water locked within their minerals. By 4 billion years ago, Earth had transformed. The hell world of the Hadean was giving way to something new. Solid continents of rock rose above the surface of the ocean, though these proto-continents were small compared to the landmasses we know today. The ocean covered most of the planet. The sky, though still thick with carbon dioxide, was clearing. The moon hung closer in the sky, its gravitational pull creating enormous tides that swept across the shallow seas. Earth's day was much shorter than it is now, perhaps only 6 hours long. The planet spun rapidly on its tilted axis, and the moon's gravity was gradually slowing that spin, stealing Earth's rotational energy and using it to push itself into a higher, more distant orbit. Volcanoes dotted the surface, both on land and under the sea. They released heat and gases from the interior, maintaining the cycle of outgassing that had built the atmosphere and ocean. The rocks of the crust, still thin and hot, were more active than they would be in later eons. They shifted and broke, sank and rose, in constant motion. Lightning cracked across the sky during the frequent storms. Thunder rolled over the empty continents and the lifeless seas. The sun, younger and slightly dimmer than it is today, rose and set every few hours, casting long shadows across a world that had never known a living thing. And yet, in this apparently barren place, the stage was being set for the most remarkable transformation in Earth's history. The water in the oceans was mixed with dissolved minerals leached from the rocks. Volcanic vents on the ocean floor pumped hot, chemical-rich water into the cold depths. Energy from the sun bathed the surface. Lightning provided electrical energy in the atmosphere. All the ingredients were present. All that was needed was time and chemistry, and perhaps a measure of chance. The violent birth of Earth was drawing to a close. The Hadean Eon, after 600 million years of fire and impacts, was ending. The next chapter in Earth's story, the Archean Eon, would see the surface stabilize further, the oceans deepen, and the first permanent continents rise from the waves. And somewhere, in some warm pool or deep ocean vent, molecules would begin to organize themselves in new and intricate ways. Life was coming, though it would arrive quietly, without fanfare, in the depths of an ancient sea. But that transformation would take time to unfold, and Earth had all the time in the world. The planet turned in the darkness, wrapped in its thick atmosphere, its oceans lapping against rocky shores. 4 billion years ago, Earth was ready for its next great change. A change that would color the sky blue, fill the air with oxygen, and eventually give rise to creatures capable of looking up at the stars and wondering how it all began. But that story belongs to the next chapter. For now, we leave the young Earth cooling in the darkness, its volcanic fires slowly dimming, its oceans settling into their basins, waiting for the chemistry of life to begin. The Archean Eon began approximately 4 billion years ago, and with it came a new stability to Earth's surface. The crust had cooled enough that rocks could remain solid for long periods, building upon one another, layer by layer, creating the first permanent continents. These early continents were not like the ones we know today. They were smaller, perhaps only scattered islands rising from a global ocean. The rocks that formed them were primarily volcanic in origin, dark basalts and lighter granites, forged in the heat of the planet's interior and pushed upward by geological forces we are still working to fully understand. In Western Australia, in a remote region called the Jack Hills, geologists have found some of Earth's oldest surviving rocks. They are metamorphic rocks, meaning they were transformed by heat and pressure. But within them lie those ancient zircon crystals we mentioned earlier, tiny time capsules preserving evidence of Earth's earliest days. Other ancient rocks survive in Greenland, in a region called Isua. These rocks are approximately 3.8 billion years old, and they tell us something important about the early Earth. They are sedimentary rocks, formed from particles that settled in water. Their very existence confirms that liquid water was present on Earth's surface by this time, possibly much earlier. The oceans of the Archean were vast and deep. They covered perhaps 90% of the planet's surface, with only small volcanic islands and proto-continents breaking through the waves. The water was not quite like modern seawater. It contained more dissolved iron, and it was more acidic, rich with carbon dioxide absorbed from the thick atmosphere. The sky above these oceans was not blue. Without free oxygen in the atmosphere, the air would have scattered light differently. The sun, still slightly cooler and dimmer than it is today, shone through an atmosphere of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. The sky was likely a perpetual haze of orange or grey, and the ocean beneath reflected these strange alien colors. Beneath the surface of these ancient seas, along the ocean floor, volcanic vents pumped superheated water into the cold depths. These hydrothermal vents, sometimes called black smokers because of the dark clouds of minerals they release, created zones of intense chemical activity. Hot, mineral-rich water mixed with cold ocean water, precipitating out compounds of iron, sulfur, and other elements. It was likely near these vents, or perhaps in shallow tidal pools warmed by the sun, that the most significant event in Earth's history occurred. Somewhere between 4 billion and 3.8 billion years ago, chemistry became biology. Molecules organized themselves into the first living cells. We do not know exactly how this happened, and it remains one of the great mysteries in science. But we can say with reasonable certainty that it did happen, because we find evidence of life in rocks as old as 3.7 billion years, possibly older. The first living things were almost certainly single-celled organisms, simpler than any bacteria alive today, but still remarkably complex compared to non-living chemistry. They had some form of membrane separating their interior from the outside world. They could take in nutrients and energy from their environment. Most importantly, they could reproduce, making copies of themselves. These first cells likely obtained energy from chemical reactions rather than from sunlight. The ocean vents provided a constant source of chemical energy: hydrogen, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and other compounds that could be combined with minerals like iron or sulfur to release energy. The earliest life forms were chemotrophs, organisms that live on chemistry alone. For hundreds of millions of years, these simple organisms were the only life on Earth. They existed in the oceans, possibly in vast numbers, but they left little trace of their presence. Soft-bodied, microscopic, they did not readily fossilize. When they died, they decomposed, returning their substance to the ocean. But around 3.5 billion years ago, some of these microbes began doing something new. They started building structures, layered mounds of sediment and minerals, trapped and bound together by communities of single-celled organisms. These structures are called stromatolites, and they represent some of the oldest visible evidence of life on Earth. Stromatolites still form today, in a few locations around the world, most famously in Shark Bay in Western Australia. They grow slowly, layer by layer, as mats of cyanobacteria trap sediment and precipitate minerals. Ancient stromatolites, preserved in rocks billions of years old, look remarkably similar to their modern counterparts. The organisms building these ancient stromatolites were probably not yet producing oxygen, but they were photosynthetic in a different way, using sunlight to power chemical reactions that did not split water molecules and release oxygen as a byproduct. They may have used compounds like hydrogen sulfide instead. The oceans of the Archean teemed with these microbes. They lived in shallow waters where sunlight could reach them, and in the deep darkness near hydrothermal vents. They floated freely in the water column, and they formed biofilms on rocks and sediment. The planet was alive, even if that life was invisible to any hypothetical observer. Around the continents, what land existed was barren. No plants grew there, no animals walked upon the rocks. The volcanic islands were sterile, except perhaps for the very edges where the ocean spray kept the rocks wet, and even there, only the simplest microbes could survive. The continents themselves were growing, though slowly. Volcanic activity continued to bring new rock to the surface. Lighter minerals, particularly silicon and aluminium compounds, tended to accumulate in the continental crust, while denser iron and magnesium minerals sank back into the mantle or remained in the oceanic crust. This process created a fundamental division on Earth that persists to this day. Continental crust is thicker and lighter than oceanic crust, which is why the continents stand higher and form dry land, while the ocean basins are lower and filled with water. Deep within the Earth, another process was beginning. The planet's interior was cooling, and the mantle was starting to convect in a more organized way. Hot rock, heated by radioactive decay deep in the mantle, would rise toward the surface. Cooler rock near the surface would sink back down. This convection created currents in the solid but flowing rock of the mantle. These convection currents began to break the crust into pieces. The thin, fragile crust could not move as a single, rigid shell. Instead, it fractured into plates that could move independently, riding on the convecting mantle below. This was the beginning of plate tectonics, the process that shapes Earth's surface even today. In the Archean, plate tectonics worked differently than it does now. The crust was thinner, the mantle hotter, the convection more vigorous. Plates may have moved faster, and the recycling of crust back into the mantle may have been more rapid. Where plates pulled apart, new ocean floor was created as magma welled up from below. Where plates collided, one would be forced beneath the other in a process called subduction, diving back into the hot mantle where it would melt and be recycled. Sometimes, two pieces of continental crust would collide, and rather than one subducting beneath the other, they would crumple and fold, building mountains. The first supercontinents may have formed during the Archean. These were not permanent features. Continents would gather together, driven by the slow churning of the mantle, then break apart again. The cycle of supercontinent formation and breakup, called the Wilson cycle, may have been faster in the Archean than it would be in later eons. One proposed supercontinent from this time has been named Valbara, after the Karpval Craton in South Africa and the Pilbara Craton in Western Australia. These are ancient, stable cores of continental crust that may have once been joined together approximately 3 billion years ago, though the evidence is fragmentary and the reconstruction uncertain. As the Archean eon progressed, the amount of continental crust increased. More and more volcanic islands rose from the sea. These islands collided and merged, forming larger landmasses. By the end of the Archean, perhaps 30% of the volume of modern continental crust had formed, though it was still scattered and fragmented. In the oceans, life continued its quiet evolution. The single-celled organisms diversified, developing new metabolisms and new ways of capturing energy. Competition for resources drove innovation. Mutations provided variation. Natural selection favored the individuals best suited to their environment. And then, approximately 2.7 billion years ago, something revolutionary happened. A group of bacteria evolved the ability to perform oxygenic photosynthesis. the process of using sunlight to split water molecules, releasing oxygen as a waste product. These organisms, the cyanobacteria, would change Earth more profoundly than any other form of life before or since. But the transformation would not be immediate. For hundreds of millions of years, the oxygen they produced was absorbed by the ocean and the rocks, removed from the environment as quickly as it was created. The iron dissolved in the ocean water reacted with oxygen to form rust, iron oxide, which precipitated out and settled to the ocean floor. These rust layers accumulated over time, creating distinctive red and black banded iron formations that geologists can find today in some of the oldest rocks on every continent. The banded iron formations are among the most striking geological features from the Archean and early Proterozoic. They consist of alternating layers of iron-rich and silica-rich minerals, sometimes just millimeters thick, extending for kilometers. The bands record the seasonal or periodic variation in oxygen production by early cyanobacteria. For as long as there was dissolved iron in the ocean to react with oxygen, the atmosphere remained oxygen-free. The ocean acted as a vast chemical buffer, absorbing all the oxygen that life produced. But the cyanobacteria continued to multiply and photosynthesize, and eventually, after hundreds of millions of years, the supply of dissolved iron began to run out. The stage was set for the next great transformation of Earth, the oxygenation of the atmosphere. But that event would mark the transition from the Archean Eon to the Proterozoic, from the ancient Earth to the Middle Earth, and it would trigger changes so profound that some scientists call it the greatest pollution event in the planet's history. Before we reach that pivotal moment, we should pause and appreciate the Archean Earth as it was. For more than 1 billion years, from 4 billion to 2.5 billion years ago, this was a world of water and rock and microbial life. The oceans were green or grey, thick with dissolved minerals. The continents were small and barren, covered in dark volcanic rocks. The sky was orange or hazy, never the clear blue we know today. The sun rose and set on a planet that turned faster than it does now, where days were shorter and the moon hung larger in the sky. Lightning still flashed across the heavens during storms, and volcanoes still erupted on land and under the sea. But beneath the surface of the ocean, in the thin films of water clinging to rocks, in the warm pools near volcanic vents, life had taken hold. It was a quiet kind of life, invisible to the naked eye, but it was relentless and inventive. These microbes explored every available niche, developing new ways to capture energy and build their cells. They competed and cooperated. They evolved. Some scientists believe that the most important evolutionary innovation of the Archean, besides the origin of life itself, was the development of the first complex cells. At some point, perhaps around 2 billion years ago, though possibly earlier, one cell engulfed another in what may have begun as an act of predation. But instead of digesting this captured cell, the host cell allowed it to continue living inside its membrane. This partnership, called endosymbiosis, proved beneficial to both organisms. The captured cell may have been able to use oxygen to generate energy more efficiently. In return, it shared some of that energy with its host. Over time, the two organisms became inseparable. The captured cell evolved into a specialized structure called a mitochondrion, which exists in nearly every complex cell today, acting as the cell's powerhouse. This event was one of the most important steps in the evolution of complex life. Another endosymbiotic event, which may have occurred later, brought photosynthetic cyanobacteria into cells, where they evolved into chloroplasts, the structures that allow plant cells to perform photosynthesis. But these events, and the complex cells they produced, likely came late in the Archean or early in the following eon. As the Archean eon drew to a close, Earth stood on the threshold of profound change. The cyanobacteria had been producing oxygen for hundreds of millions of years. The ocean had absorbed that oxygen, but now the dissolved iron was running low. The chemical buffer was nearly exhausted. Soon, oxygen would begin to accumulate in the atmosphere. When that happened, life would face its first great crisis, a crisis that would kill off many of the organisms that had evolved in the oxygen-free world of the Archean. But it would also open new possibilities. Oxygen is a reactive element, and organisms that could harness its power would have access to far more energy than those relying on older metabolisms. The stage was set for an explosion of biological complexity. The blue planet was about to be born. The transformation from the grey-green oceans and orange skies of the Archean to the blue oceans and blue skies we know today would be one of the most dramatic changes in Earth's history, and it would be driven entirely by the accumulation of a single gas, oxygen, produced by living organisms. We will turn to that transformation next, to the Great Oxidation event and the billion years of change that followed. But for now, we leave the Archean Earth as the cyanobacteria multiply in the sunlit shallows, their oxygen dissolving into the sea, the iron slowly rusting away, and the atmosphere waiting, just waiting, for the moment when everything would change. Approximately 2.4 billion years ago, Earth's atmosphere underwent the most dramatic chemical transformation in the planet's history. After hundreds of millions of years of cyanobacterial photosynthesis, after the oceans had absorbed all the oxygen they could hold, the gas finally began to accumulate in the air. This event is called the Great Oxidation event, or sometimes the Great Oxygenation event. To many of the organisms that had evolved in Earth's oxygen-free environment, this change was catastrophic. Oxygen, for all its benefits to modern life, is a toxic and highly reactive substance. The microbes that had thrived in the Archean oceans were adapted to a world without free oxygen. They used metabolisms based on sulfur, iron, methane, and hydrogen. When oxygen levels began to rise, these organisms faced a crisis. Oxygen damaged their cellular machinery. It created reactive molecules that destroyed proteins and DNA. Many species probably went extinct during this time, though we have no fossil record to confirm it. Others retreated to environments where oxygen could not reach. Deep ocean sediments, isolated pockets of groundwater, the guts of animals in ages yet to come. These anaerobic organisms, as we call them, still exist today, but they are confined to oxygen-free refuges. The organisms that survived and thrived were those that could tolerate oxygen, or, better yet, use it to their advantage. Aerobic respiration, the process of using oxygen to break down food molecules and extract energy, is far more efficient than the older anaerobic metabolisms. A cell that can use oxygen can generate perhaps 18 times more energy from the same amount of food. This abundance of energy would eventually make possible the evolution of complex, multicellular life. But that development was still more than 1 billion years in the future. The Great Oxidation event occurred approximately 2.4 billion years ago. Complex animals would not appear until around 600 million years ago. The intervening period, from 2.5 billion to 541 million years ago, is called the Proterozoic Eon. It means earlier life, and it was a time of slow changes, of long stretches of relative stability punctuated by dramatic events. When oxygen first accumulated in the atmosphere, it did not reach modern levels immediately. The increase was gradual and uneven. Estimates suggest that oxygen levels may have risen to perhaps 1 to 10% of modern atmospheric oxygen during the early Proterozoic, then remained at those levels for more than 1 billion years. The sky began to change color during this time. Oxygen molecules in the atmosphere scatter blue light more effectively than red light. As oxygen levels rose, the sky would have gradually shifted from its Archean orange or grey to a paler blue, though perhaps not as deep and vibrant as the blue we know today. The oceans, too, underwent transformation. The dissolved iron that had given them their greenish tint was mostly gone, precipitated out as rust, and settled on the ocean floor. The water became clearer, though it still contained high levels of other dissolved minerals and was more acidic than modern seawater. The continents continued to grow during the Proterozoic. More volcanic activity, more accumulation of lighter minerals, more collisions between crustal fragments. All these processes added to the volume of continental crust. By 1.8 billion years ago, approximately half of the modern continental crust had formed. Around 2 billion years ago, or perhaps slightly earlier, the continents began to gather together into a supercontinent. This ancient landmass is called Columbia or Nuna by geologists. The reconstruction of its exact shape and configuration is difficult because the evidence has been scattered and altered by 2 billion years of subsequent geological activity. But we know from the ages and magnetic alignments of rocks on different modern continents that they were once joined together. Columbia may have looked like a single large landmass with scattered smaller continents around it. The global ocean surrounded this supercontinent, and the climate would have been affected by its geography. Large continents affect climate in ways that scattered smaller continents do not. The interior of a supercontinent, far from the moderating influence of the ocean, tends to be drier and subject to greater temperature extremes. Monsoons may develop, bringing seasonal rains to the edges while leaving the heart of the continent arid. Columbia existed for perhaps 500 million years before beginning to break apart around 1.5 billion years ago. The fragments drifted, then began to gather again. By 1.1 billion years ago, they had assembled into a new supercontinent called Rodinia. Rodinia was likely the largest single landmass Earth had seen up to that point. It may have stretched from pole to pole, or nearly so, and it encompassed most, or all, of Earth's continental crust. The exact configuration is still debated by geologists, but most reconstructions place the ancient core of North America near the center. The assembly and breakup of supercontinents is driven by the convection in Earth's mantle. Hot mantle material rises beneath the ocean floor, creating new crust at mid-ocean ridges. The crust spreads outward, eventually colliding with continental margins. Over hundreds of millions of years, this process can push continents together. But once a supercontinent forms, it acts as an insulating blanket over the mantle below. Heat accumulates beneath the continent. Eventually, the crust begins to dome upward and crack. Magma pushes up through the cracks. The supercontinent begins to rift apart. This cycle of assembly and breakup has repeated multiple times in Earth's history. Each supercontinent lasts for perhaps 200 to 400 million years before fragmenting. The fragments drift, and then, hundreds of millions of years later, they come together again in a new configuration. While Rodinia existed from about 1.1 billion to 750 million years ago, life continued its slow evolution in the oceans. The single-celled organisms that dominated the Archean were joined by more complex cells, the eukaryotes, which had evolved through endosymbiosis. These eukaryotic cells were larger and more elaborate than bacteria. They had internal structures, a nucleus containing their DNA, mitochondria to generate energy, and in some cases, chloroplasts to perform photosynthesis. They had more complex metabolisms and more sophisticated ways of interacting with their environment. Some eukaryotes began to form colonies, groups of individual cells living together. These colonies were not quite multicellular organisms, because each cell could still survive on its own if separated. but they represented a step in that direction, a proof of concept that cooperation between cells could be beneficial. By around 1 billion years ago, the first true multicellular organisms may have evolved. These were likely simple creatures, perhaps resembling modern algae or seaweeds. They lived in the ocean, anchored to rocks or floating freely. They had different cell types that performed different functions, marking a fundamental shift in the organization of life. The evolution of multicellularity opened new possibilities. Larger organisms could occupy ecological niches that single cells could not. They could grow tall to capture more sunlight or develop specialized structures for feeding or reproduction. But multicellular life was still rare and simple during most of the Proterozoic. Then, approximately 750 million years ago, as Rodinia began to break apart, Earth entered one of the most extreme climatic periods in its history. The planet experienced a series of intense ice ages, so severe that ice may have covered the entire globe from pole to equator. These episodes are called Snowball Earth events, and they represent perhaps the closest Earth has ever come to becoming completely uninhabitable. There are at least two major Snowball Earth episodes, one around 720 million years ago and another around 635 million years ago. The exact cause of these global glaciations is still debated, but the breakup of Rodinia likely played a role. When a supercontinent breaks apart, the fragments create new coastlines and shallow seas. These environments are ideal for certain types of rock weathering. Silicate rocks, when exposed to rain and water, undergo chemical weathering. They react with carbon dioxide dissolved in the rainwater, forming carbonates and releasing other minerals. This process removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locks it away in rocks. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat in the atmosphere. If too much carbon dioxide is removed through weathering, the planet can cool. Once it starts cooling, ice forms at the poles. Ice is white and reflective, bouncing sunlight back into space. This causes further cooling, allowing the ice to spread. This is called a positive feedback loop, and during a Snowball Earth event, it may have run to completion. Ice spread from the poles toward the equator, covering more and more of the ocean. As it spread, it reflected more sunlight, causing more cooling, allowing more ice to form. Eventually, the ice may have reached all the way to the equator. The oceans froze, perhaps to a depth of 1 kilometer or more in some places. The only liquid water would have been in pockets beneath the ice, or near volcanic vents on the ocean floor. With the oceans frozen and the continents buried under glaciers, photosynthesis would have nearly ceased. The cyanobacteria and algae that produced oxygen would have been trapped under the ice, cut off from sunlight. Oxygen production would have plummeted, and oxygen levels in the atmosphere may have dropped significantly. This raises a question: how did life survive? If the Earth was completely frozen for millions of years, how did anything live through it? The answer may be that the freeze was not quite total. Even during the most severe snowball episodes, there were likely refuges. Volcanic islands, warmed by their internal heat, may have had ice-free patches. Deep ocean vents continue to provide heat and nutrients. And even under the ice, in the cold darkness, some organisms likely survived in a dormant state. The Snowball Earth events eventually ended because of volcanism. Even with the surface frozen, volcanic activity continued. Volcanoes erupted on land and under the sea, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Soft, thoughtful tone. Normally, this carbon dioxide would be removed by weathering, but with the continents covered in ice, weathering essentially stopped. The volcanic carbon dioxide accumulated in the atmosphere, with nothing to remove it. Over millions of years, greenhouse gas levels rose higher and higher. Eventually, the greenhouse effect became strong enough to overcome the reflectivity of the ice. The planet began to warm. Ice at the equator, where sunlight was strongest even during the freeze, began to melt. This created patches of dark ocean water, which absorbed more sunlight than ice, causing more warming. The positive feedback that had driven Earth into the freeze now operated in reverse. Warming melted ice, which reduced reflectivity, which caused more warming. The planet rapidly transitioned from icehouse to hothouse, with atmospheric carbon dioxide levels perhaps hundreds of times higher than modern levels. The end of a Snowball Earth event would have been a time of intense weathering and erosion. Torrential rains fell on the newly exposed rocks. The accumulated carbon dioxide dissolved in the water, making it acidic. This acidic water rapidly weathered the rocks, creating distinctive geological formations that geologists can still identify today. When the weathering products washed into the ocean, they included large amounts of calcium and carbonate ions. These combined to form calcium carbonate, which precipitated out and settled on the ocean floor in thick layers. These cap carbonates, as they are called, mark the end of each Snowball Earth episode. Life survived these extreme events, but they may have acted as evolutionary bottlenecks. Many species likely went extinct, while others survived and diversified in the changed world that emerged after the ice melted. Some scientists believe that the stress of the Snowball Earth events may have spurred evolutionary innovation. The survivors were the organisms most capable of adapting to extreme environmental changes. When conditions improved, these hardy survivors had opportunities to evolve in new directions. By 600 million years ago, after the last Snowball Earth event ended, Earth was primed for a biological revolution. Multicellular organisms were becoming more common and more complex. The oceans were rich with nutrients washed from the continents during the Ice Age's end. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere were rising again as photosynthetic organisms recovered and multiplied. The stage was set for the Cambrian Explosion, the sudden diversification of animal life that would occur around 540 million years ago. But before we reach that pivotal moment, we should appreciate the late Proterozoic world as it was. This was an Earth recovering from its most severe climate crisis, an Earth where life was evolving new forms of complexity, where the continents were fragmenting and drifting, preparing the geography that would shape the next era. The fragments of Rodinia had spread across the globe. Large oceans separated the continental pieces. The climate was moderating after the extreme greenhouse conditions that had melted the ice. Oxygen levels were fluctuating, but generally trending upward. In the oceans, strange new creatures were appearing. These were the Ediacaran organisms, named after the Ediacara Hills in Australia, where their fossils were first discovered. They lived between 635 and 541 million years ago, in the final period of the Proterozoic. The Ediacaran organisms were unlike anything that exists today. Some resembled fronds or leaves, anchored to the ocean floor. Others looked like quilted mattresses or bizarre discs. Many had a fractal-like structure, with similar patterns repeating at different scales. These creatures were soft-bodied, leaving only impressions in the sediment when they died. They had no shells, no hard parts, no teeth or claws. They may have obtained nutrients by absorbing dissolved organic matter, or perhaps by hosting photosynthetic bacteria in their tissues. The Ediacaran world was peaceful in a way that no later period would be. There were no predators, because animals had not yet evolved the ability to hunt and consume other animals. The creatures that lived on the ocean floor did so without fear, without the need for defenses. This period could not last. Evolution was pushing toward greater complexity, toward animals with senses and mobility, toward predation and the arms race it creates. The Cambrian Explosion was coming, and when it arrived, it would transform Earth's oceans forever. The Proterozoic Eon, which had lasted for nearly 2 billion years, was drawing to a close. It had been an eon of slow changes and rare catastrophes, of oxygenation and glaciation, of continental assembly and breakup, of life evolving from single cells to simple multicellular forms. The next chapter would see the pace of change accelerate. The Phanerozoic Eon, the age of visible life, was about to begin. The oceans would fill with animals, plants would colonize the land, the continents would continue their slow dance, and life would spread into every available niche. We turn now to that great flowering of life, to the Cambrian seas and the ancient creatures that swam in them. We will watch as life moves from ocean to land, as forests grow and animals learn to fly, as mass extinctions clear the stage and evolution fills it again with new and wondrous forms. But all of it rests on the foundation laid in the Proterozoic, on the oxygen that filled the air, on the continents that rose from the sea, on the simple organisms that learned to cooperate and build bodies of many cells. The age of complex life was built on billions of years of preparation, and now, finally, the moment had arrived. 541 million years ago, at the dawn of the Cambrian period, Earth's oceans underwent a transformation so rapid and profound that it stands as one of the great mysteries in the history of life. Within a geological blink of an eye, perhaps 10 to 20 million years, animals evolved most of the major body plans that exist today. This event is called the Cambrian Explosion, though it was not an explosion in the literal sense. Rather, it was a sudden flowering of biological diversity, a proliferation of new forms, new strategies for survival, new ways of interacting with the environment and with other organisms. The fossils from the early Cambrian show us creatures with eyes, with armor, with claws and shells and segmented bodies. They show us predators and prey, hunters and hunted, animals that burrowed into the mud, and animals that swam freely through the water column. Why did this explosion of diversity happen when it did? Scientists have proposed several factors that may have worked together. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere and ocean had risen high enough to support larger, more active animals. The evolution of predation created an arms race, driving rapid innovation in both offensive and defensive adaptations. There may also have been genetic factors. The evolution of certain developmental genes, which control how an embryo grows and how body parts form, may have made it easier for organisms to evolve new body plans. Small changes in these regulatory genes could produce large changes in body structure. Whatever the causes, the result was spectacular. One of the most famous windows into the Cambrian world is the Burgess Shale in British Columbia, Canada. This fossil deposit preserves soft-bodied animals in exquisite detail, showing us creatures that would otherwise have left no trace. The Burgess Shale is approximately 508 million years old, placing it in the Middle Cambrian. The fossils were formed when animals living on the ocean floor were buried by underwater mudslides. The mud was fine-grained and oxygen poor, preventing decay and allowing even soft tissues to be preserved as impressions in the rock. Among the creatures found in the Burgess Shale is Anomalocaris, one of the largest predators of its time. This animal grew up to a meter in length, enormous by Cambrian standards. It had a circular mouth lined with plates, large eyes on stalks, and a pair of grasping appendages at the front of its body for capturing prey. Another famous Burgess Shale animal is Opabinia, a peculiar creature with 5 eyes and a long, flexible proboscis tipped with a grasping claw. Hallucigenia, despite its bizarre appearance with spines along its back and tentacles along its underside, is now believed to be related to modern velvet worms. But perhaps the most significant creatures in the Cambrian seas were the trilobites. These arthropods, related to modern insects and crustaceans, dominated the ocean floor for nearly 300 million years. They had segmented bodies, jointed legs, and compound eyes, some of the first complex eyes in the animal kingdom. Trilobites were incredibly diverse, with thousands of known species. Some were predators, some were scavengers, some filtered food particles from the water. They ranged in size from less than a millimeter to over half a meter. They lived in shallow tropical seas and in the deep ocean, from the equator to near the poles. The Cambrian oceans were warm and shallow, at least in the tropical regions where most of our fossils come from. Sea levels were generally high during this period, and large areas of the continents were flooded by shallow seas. These epicontinental seas, as they are called, provided vast habitats for marine life. The continents themselves were still drifting, still assembling and breaking apart. During the early Paleozoic era, which includes the Cambrian and the periods that followed it, several major landmasses existed. Laurentia, which would become North America, was situated near the equator. Gondwana, a massive supercontinent that included what would become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India, dominated the southern hemisphere. The climate during the Cambrian was generally warm, with no evidence of polar ice caps. Carbon dioxide levels were much higher than today, creating a strong greenhouse effect. The lack of land plants meant that weathering rates were lower, allowing volcanic carbon dioxide to accumulate in the atmosphere. As we move forward in time into the Ordovician period, around 485 million years ago, we see the continued diversification of marine life. The Ordovician seas teemed with life. Trilobites remained abundant, but they were joined by new groups. Brachiopods, shelled animals that superficially resemble clams but are actually unrelated, became extremely common. Crinoids, also called sea lilies, extended their feathery arms to filter food from the water while anchored to the ocean floor by long stalks. Nautiloids, relatives of the modern chambered nautilus, swam through the water with their coiled or straight shells. The Ordovician also saw the evolution of the first vertebrates. These were jawless fish, armored with bony plates, living on the ocean floor where they fed on bottom-dwelling invertebrates. They were small and simple compared to later fish, but they represented an important step in our own evolutionary lineage. Then, approximately 443 million years ago, disaster struck. The end of the Ordovician saw one of the 5 great mass extinctions in Earth's history. Approximately 85% of all marine species went extinct over a relatively short period. The cause appears to have been a rapid climate change. Gondwana had drifted over the South Pole, and an ice age developed quickly. Glaciers formed on the southern continent. Sea levels dropped as water was locked up in ice. The shallow epicontinental seas, which had provided so much habitat for marine life, largely drained away. Then, equally quickly, the ice age ended. Sea levels rose again, but the ocean chemistry had changed. The rapid glaciation and deglaciation may have disrupted ocean circulation, creating zones of oxygen-poor water. Many species could not adapt quickly enough to survive. Life recovered from this extinction, as it always has. The Silurian period, from 443 to 419 million years ago, saw the repopulation of the oceans. But it also saw something new, the first steps of life onto land. Plants had likely begun colonizing the land margins during the late Ordovician, but in the Silurian they became more diverse and widespread. The earliest land plants were small, no more than a few centimeters tall, and they lacked true roots, leaves, or flowers. They resembled modern mosses and liverworts, growing in mats along the edges of streams and in moist soils. These pioneer plants faced enormous challenges. They needed to extract water and minerals from the soil without drying out. They needed to stand upright against gravity without the support of water. They needed to reproduce in an environment where their sperm cells could no longer swim to the eggs as they did in the ocean. Thoughtful tone. Evolution solved these problems through a series of innovations. Plants developed a waxy cuticle to prevent water loss. They evolved vascular tissue, specialized tubes to transport water and nutrients through their bodies. They developed roots to anchor themselves and absorb water, and they evolved spores that could survive in the air. Following the plants came the animals. The first land animals were likely arthropods, relatives of modern millipedes, centipedes, and insects. They were small, possibly living in the moist leaf litter and soil where the first plants grew. By the Devonian period, from 419 to 358 million years ago, life on land was flourishing. The Devonian is sometimes called the Age of Fishes because of the extraordinary diversity of fish that evolved during this time. Jawed fish appeared and rapidly diversified. They had a huge advantage over their jawless ancestors. They could bite, grip, and process food more efficiently. Armored placoderms, some growing to massive sizes, were the top predators of Devonian seas. Sharks appeared, with their cartilaginous skeletons and replaceable teeth. Perhaps most importantly, lobe-finned fish evolved during the Devonian. These fish had fleshy, muscular fins supported by bones. In some species, these fins could be used to prop the fish up in shallow water, or even to walk short distances on land. Around 375 million years ago, some lobe-finned fish began to spend more and more time out of water. They may have been escaping predators, or pursuing prey, or simply moving between pools during dry seasons. Whatever the reason, natural selection favored individuals with stronger fins, more efficient lungs, and better ability to breathe air. These fish gradually evolved into the first tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates. Tiktaalik, discovered in Arctic Canada in rocks about 375 million years old, shows the transition beautifully. It had fish-like scales and fins, but also a flattened head, a neck, and shoulders that could support its weight on land. By the late Devonian, true tetrapods had evolved. They still spent much of their time in water, but they could walk on land with their four limbs. They breathed air with lungs, though they still had gills as well. They were the ancestors of all amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, including us. On land, plants were growing taller and more complex. The Devonians saw the evolution of the first forests. These were not forests of flowering trees, but rather forests of ferns, horsetails, and early seed plants. Some of these plants, like the tree fern Archaeopteris, grew up to 30 meters tall. The spread of forests had profound effects on Earth's climate and geology. Plant roots broke up rocks, increasing the rate of weathering and drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide. Dead plant material accumulated in swamps, eventually forming the coal deposits we mine today. The Carboniferous period, from 358 to 298 million years ago, is named for these coal deposits. It was a time of vast tropical swamps, enormous trees, and strange insects. Oxygen levels during the Carboniferous were the highest in Earth's history, possibly reaching 35% of the atmosphere, compared to 21% today. This oxygen-rich air allowed arthropods to grow to enormous sizes. Dragonflies with wingspans of over 0.5 meter flew through the forests. Millipedes grew to more than 2 meters in length. The Carboniferous was also when tetrapods fully conquered the land. Amphibians diversified into many forms, some still tied to water for reproduction, others venturing deeper into the continental interiors. Then, around 320 million years ago, the amniotic egg evolved. This was perhaps the most important adaptation in the history of land vertebrates. The amniotic egg, with its protective shell and internal membranes, could be laid on dry land. The embryo developed in its own private pond, protected from desiccation and predators. The animals that evolved this adaptation were the first reptiles. They were initially small, lizard-like creatures, but they had freed themselves from the water. They could live their entire lives on land, laying eggs in hidden nests, breathing only air, drinking water when they found it, but not requiring it for reproduction. From these early reptiles, all other reptiles, birds, and mammals would eventually evolve. But in the Carboniferous, they were still relatively minor players, living in the shadows of the giant amphibians and the enormous arthropods. The continents during the Carboniferous were converging again. The assembly of the next supercontinent was underway. By the Permian period, from 298 to 252 million years ago, the landmasses had joined together to form Pangaea, perhaps the most complete supercontinent in Earth's history. Pangaea stretched from pole to pole, and nearly all of Earth's continental crust was united in this single massive landmass. The interior of Pangaea was far from any ocean, creating vast deserts and extreme seasonal climate variations. Monsoons brought torrential rains to the coasts, but the heart of the continent was arid. Reptiles thrived in this drier world. They diversified into many forms. Some became large herbivores, cropping the tough vegetation. Others became predators, hunting the herbivores. Still others returned to the water, evolving into marine reptiles. One group of reptiles, the synapsids, became particularly successful. These were the mammal-like reptiles, so called because they were on the evolutionary line leading to mammals. Early synapsids like Dimetrodon, with its distinctive sail-like back, were apex predators of the Permian. The Permian world was harsh but vibrant. Conifer forests grew in the wetter regions. Insects and other arthropods were abundant. In the oceans, reefs formed from sponges and other organisms. Life had spread across the globe, adapting to every available environment. And then, 252 million years ago, came the greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life on Earth. The Permian Triassic extinction event, sometimes called the Great Dying, killed approximately 95% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. The extinction was likely caused by a combination of factors. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released enormous quantities of lava, covering an area larger than Europe. These eruptions also released vast amounts of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases. The climate warmed dramatically. Ocean circulation may have broken down, creating dead zones with no oxygen. Acid rain fell on the continents. The ocean became more acidic, dissolving the shells of many marine organisms. On land and in the sea, the combination of heat, acid, and anoxia proved deadly. The extinction unfolded over perhaps 60,000 years, which is instantaneous in geological time, but long enough that multiple causes may have contributed. When it was over, Earth's ecosystems were devastated. The once thriving Permian world was reduced to a handful of surviving species. But life, as always, proved resilient. The survivors of the Great Dying would repopulate the planet. They would evolve into new forms, filling the empty ecological niches. And from the ashes of the Permian world, a new age was about to dawn, the age of dinosaurs. We will turn to that age next, to the Mesozoic era and the creatures that dominated it for more than 150 million years. But the story of the Paleozoic era, from the Cambrian Explosion to the Great Dying, is one of continual innovation, of life spreading from ocean to land, of plants growing tall and animals taking to the air. It was an era that established the basic patterns of life on Earth, the presence of forests, the dominance of vertebrates on land, the complex ecosystems of predator and prey. Everything that would follow, from dinosaurs to humans, built on the foundations laid in those ancient seas and on those early continents. The Paleozoic ended in fire and death. but it gave us our world. And as we move into the Mesozoic, we carry with us the legacy of those ancient times, written in our bones and in our DNA, in the coal beneath our feet and the oxygen in our lungs. The Triassic period began in the wake of devastation. 252 million years ago, as Earth recovered from the Permian extinction, the planet was a changed place. The supercontinent Pangaea dominated the globe, and the climate was hot and arid across much of its interior. The survivors of the Great Dying were a mix of reptiles, amphibians, and a few hardy plant species. For the first 10 million years of the Triassic, ecosystems remained relatively simple. Species diversity was low. The recovery was slow, as evolution worked to fill the empty ecological niches left by the extinction. But gradually, life rebounded. New groups of reptiles evolved and diversified. Among them were the archosaurs, a lineage that would eventually give rise to crocodiles, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and birds. The early archosaurs were small to medium-sized predators, but they had several advantages over other reptiles. They had more efficient, upright postures, with legs positioned more directly beneath their bodies, rather than sprawling out to the sides. This allowed them to move faster and with less energy expenditure. By the late Triassic, around 230 million years ago, the first true dinosaurs appeared. They were small, bipedal creatures, probably no larger than a modern turkey. They ran on their hind legs, using their tails for balance, and they were likely quick and agile predators. At the same time, another important group was evolving, the mammals. The mammal-like reptiles of the Permian had survived the extinction, and their descendants were becoming increasingly mammalian in their characteristics. They developed fur, more complex teeth, and possibly warm-bloodedness. The first true mammals appeared in the late Triassic, around 225 million years ago. They were small, most no larger than a mouse or rat. They were likely nocturnal, avoiding the larger reptiles that dominated the daylight hours. They had keen senses of hearing and smell, large brains relative to their body size, and they probably fed on insects. The Triassic ended with another mass extinction, approximately 201 million years ago. This extinction was less severe than the Great Dying, but it still eliminated many groups of large reptiles and amphibians. The cause may have been volcanic activity associated with the beginning breakup of Pangaea. Whatever the cause, the extinction cleared the way for the dinosaurs to rise to dominance. The Jurassic period, from 201 to 145 million years ago, was the age when dinosaurs truly came into their own. Pangaea was splitting apart during the Jurassic. The Atlantic Ocean was beginning to form as North America and Europe separated from South America and Africa. This breakup created new coastlines and changed ocean currents. The climate became wetter and more humid than it had been in the Triassic. Forests spread across the continents. Conifers grew tall, along with cycads, ginkgos, and ferns. There were no flowering plants yet. Those would not evolve until the following period. But the Jurassic forests were lush and green. In these forests and across the plains, dinosaurs grew to enormous sizes. The sauropods, long-necked herbivores, became the largest land animals that have ever existed. Diplodocus stretched 30 meters from head to tail. Brachiosaurus stood as tall as a 4-story building. Argentinosaurus, from the later Cretaceous period, may have weighed as much as 90 tons. How did these animals support such enormous masses? Their bones were not solid, but filled with air sacs, making them lighter. Their long necks allowed them to reach vegetation that other animals could not. They had efficient digestive systems, fermenting plant matter in large guts, and they likely had high metabolic rates, more similar to birds than to modern reptiles. Hunting the giant herbivores were predators like Allosaurus, a carnivore up to 10 meters long, with powerful jaws and sharp teeth. But not all dinosaurs were giants. Many were small, quick, and likely intelligent. Compsognathus was no larger than a chicken, while Archaeopteryx, discovered in Jurassic rocks in Germany, shows the transition from small feathered dinosaurs to true birds. Archaeopteryx had feathers and wings, like a bird, but also teeth and a long bony tail, like a reptile. It could probably fly, though perhaps not as well as modern birds. It represents a beautiful example of a transitional form, caught in the act of evolution from one group to another.
Feathers, it turns out, evolved before flight.
Many dinosaurs had feathers or feather-like structures, probably initially for insulation rather than flight. Small theropod dinosaurs were likely covered in downy plumage. Over time, some of these dinosaurs evolved longer, more elaborate feathers on their arms, and eventually these structures became capable of supporting flight. While dinosaurs ruled the land, other reptiles dominated the sky and sea. Pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, were not dinosaurs but a separate lineage of archosaurs. They had wings made of skin stretched between an elongated fourth finger and their bodies. They ranged from sparrow-sized species to giants like Quetzalcoatlus, with wingspans exceeding 10 meters. In the oceans, marine reptiles evolved from land-dwelling ancestors. Ichthyosaurs looked remarkably like dolphins, a beautiful example of convergent evolution. Different lineages evolving similar body shapes to suit similar environments. Plesiosaurs had long necks or paddle-like flippers. Mosasaurs were massive predators, some reaching lengths of 15 meters. The Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous period, approximately 145 million years ago. The Cretaceous, which would last until 66 million years ago, was the final period of the Mesozoic era, and it saw the peak of dinosaur diversity. The continents continued to drift apart during the Cretaceous. South America separated from Africa. India was an island continent drifting northward toward Asia. Australia and Antarctica were still connected, but were moving southward away from the other land masses. Sea levels were very high during much of the Cretaceous. Large areas of the continents were flooded by shallow seas. In North America, a seaway stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, dividing the continent in two. The climate was warm, with no polar ice caps. Even Antarctica was forested. The most significant botanical development of the Cretaceous was the evolution of flowering plants, or angiosperms. These plants first appeared in the fossil record around 130 million years ago. They were initially small, weedy species in disturbed habitats, but they rapidly diversified and spread. Flowering plants had several advantages over earlier plant groups. Their flowers allowed for more efficient pollination, often with the help of insects. Their fruits protected seeds and aided in dispersal, often by attracting animals that would eat the fruits and spread the seeds in their droppings. They grew faster and could colonize new habitats more quickly. By the late Cretaceous, flowering plants dominated many ecosystems. Forests of oak, magnolia, and laurel grew across the continents. Grasses had not yet evolved, but other flowering plants filled meadows and prairies. The dinosaurs evolved alongside these changing floras. New groups of herbivorous dinosaurs appeared, specialized for feeding on flowering plants. The hadrosaurs, or duck-billed dinosaurs, had elaborate dental batteries, hundreds of teeth arranged in grinding surfaces, perfect for processing tough plant material. Ceratopsians, like Triceratops, evolved in North America and Asia. They had large, bony frills extending from the back of their skulls and horns on their faces. These structures may have been used for defense against predators, for display to attract mates, or for combat between rival males. The ankylosaurs were covered in bony armor, with some species having club-like masses of bone at the end of their tails for defense. The pachycephalosaurs had enormously thick skull roofs, possibly used for headbutting contests. Meanwhile, predatory dinosaurs were evolving new forms as well. The tyrannosaurs appeared in the Cretaceous, with Tyrannosaurus rex being perhaps the most famous dinosaur of all. This massive predator grew up to 13 meters long, with a skull over 1.5 meters in length and teeth like railroad spikes. But recent discoveries have revealed that Tyrannosaurus, like many theropod dinosaurs, may have had a coat of feathers, at least when young. The line between dinosaurs and birds had always been blurred, and it was becoming increasingly clear that birds simply are dinosaurs, the only lineage of dinosaurs that survived to the present day. While dinosaurs dominated the Mesozoic, mammals remained small and mostly nocturnal. But they were diversifying quietly, evolving new forms and new adaptations. By the Cretaceous, several major mammalian lineages had appeared, including the ancestors of modern monotremes, marsupials, and placental mammals. Then, 66 million years ago, catastrophe struck from the sky. An asteroid approximately 10 kilometers in diameter hit the Earth near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact created a crater 180 kilometers wide and released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs. The effects were immediate and devastating. The impact threw up vast quantities of rock and dust into the atmosphere. Some of this material was ejected with such force that it escaped Earth's atmosphere entirely, then rained back down as molten debris, igniting fires across the globe. The sky darkened as dust and soot blocked out the sun. Temperatures plummeted. Photosynthesis ceased for months or years. Plants died, and with them died the herbivores that depended on them, and then the carnivores that hunted the herbivores. The impact may have also triggered massive volcanic eruptions in India, in a region called the Deccan Traps. These eruptions released additional gases and dust into the atmosphere, prolonging the environmental crisis. When the dust finally settled, approximately 75% of all species on Earth were extinct. All non-avian dinosaurs were gone. The pterosaurs were gone. The marine reptiles were gone. Many species of plants, insects, fish, and other organisms disappeared as well. But some groups survived. Birds made it through, though only a handful of lineages. Crocodilians survived. Turtles and lizards survived. And crucially for our story, many mammals survived. The extinction of the dinosaurs left the world open for mammals to diversify. No longer confined to small body sizes and nocturnal lifestyles, mammals rapidly evolved to fill the ecological roles left vacant by the dinosaurs. The Cenozoic era, which began 66 million years ago and continues to the present, is sometimes called the Age of Mammals. During the Paleocene epoch, the first 10 million years of the Cenozoic, mammals diversified rapidly. Some became large browsers, others small insectivores, still others predators. By the Eocene epoch, from 56 to 34 million years ago, the world was warm and tropical. Forests extended to the polar regions. Mammals had evolved into many of the major groups we know today: primates, carnivores, ungulates, whales, bats. The primates, our own order, were initially small, tree-dwelling animals with grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and large brains relative to their body size. They lived in the tropical forests, feeding on fruits, insects, and leaves. Over time, they diversified into many forms. One major split in primate evolution occurred around 40 million years ago, separating the ancestors of Old World monkeys and apes from the ancestors of New World monkeys. Another split, around 25 million years ago, separated the lesser apes, like gibbons, from the great apes, the lineage that includes orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. The climate began to cool during the Oligocene epoch, from 34 to 23 million years ago. Antarctica developed ice sheets. The global tropical forests retreated toward the equator. In their place, temperate forests, grasslands spread. The evolution of grasses had profound effects on mammalian evolution. Grasses are tough, high in silica, and difficult to digest, but they grow quickly and can recover from grazing. As grasslands spread, mammals evolved adaptations for living in open habitats and for processing grass. Horses, which had been small forest browsers, evolved into larger, plains-dwelling grazers with high-crowned teeth for grinding tough grass. Many other groups, including cattle, antelope, and elephants, evolved similar adaptations. Predators, in turn, evolved to hunt these grassland herbivores. Around 7 million years ago in Africa, a lineage of apes began to adapt to life in more open, drier environments. These were the early hominins, the ancestors of modern humans. They were still ape-like in many ways, but they had begun to walk upright on two legs more regularly than their forest-dwelling relatives. Bipedalism, walking on two legs, freed the hands for other uses. It allowed early hominins to carry food, tools, and infants while moving. It may have helped with thermoregulation in hot, open environments. Whatever the initial advantages, bipedalism became the defining characteristic of the hominin lineage. By 4 million years ago, several species of Australopithecines lived in East and South Africa. They were bipedal but still had small brains, about the size of a chimpanzee's brain. They likely lived in small social groups, used simple tools, and ate a varied diet of fruits, leaves, and possibly some meat. Around 2.8 million years ago, the first members of our genus, Homo, appeared. Homo habilis, or handyman, had a slightly larger brain than the Australopithecines and was associated with more sophisticated stone tools. The climate was changing during this period. The Pleistocene epoch, which began 2.6 million years ago, was characterized by repeated glaciations, ice ages. Massive ice sheets advanced and retreated across the northern continents in cycles lasting tens of thousands of years. These climate fluctuations may have driven human evolution by creating variable, challenging environments. Species that could adapt to changing conditions, that could solve problems and modify their behavior, had an advantage. Brain size increased in the Homo lineage. Homo erectus appeared around 2 million years ago. This species had a significantly larger brain, used more advanced tools, probably controlled fire, and was the first hominin to leave Africa, spreading into Asia and possibly Europe. By several 100,000 years ago, different human species existed in different parts of the world. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans lived in Eastern Asia. Homo floresiensis, a small-bodied species, lived on the island of Flores in Indonesia. Then, around 300,000 years ago in Africa, our own species, Homo sapiens, evolved. Anatomically modern humans had large brains, complex language, symbolic thought, and sophisticated tool use. They created art, buried their dead with ceremony, and developed complex social structures. Around 70,000 years ago, some populations of Homo sapiens began to leave Africa. They spread into the Middle East, then into Asia and Europe. They reached Australia by 65,000 years ago, crossing significant stretches of ocean. They entered the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. As modern humans spread across the globe, they encountered other human species. In Europe and Western Asia, they met and interbred with Neanderthals. In Asia, they interbred with Denisovans. Most people alive today carry small amounts of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA as a result of these ancient encounters. But by around 40,000 years ago, all other human species had disappeared. Only Homo sapiens remained, spread across every continent except Antarctica, adapting to environments from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra. The most recent ice age reached its peak around 20,000 years ago. Ice sheets covered northern Europe, northern Asia, and much of North America. Sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today because so much water was locked up in ice. Humans survived this harsh climate through ingenuity. They made warm clothing from animal skins. They built shelters. They hunted large game like mammoths and bison. They developed sophisticated stone tools, bone tools, and weapons. Then, around 12,000 years ago, the ice began to retreat. The planet warmed, sea levels rose. The great ice sheets melted, and the modern climate zones became established. We entered the Holocene epoch, the warm interglacial period in which we still live. Around 10,000 years ago, in several places around the world independently, humans began to domesticate plants and animals. They planted seeds, tended crops, and saved the harvest. They kept sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. This agricultural revolution transformed human society. Permanent settlements grew into villages, then towns, then cities. Writing was invented. Mathematics, astronomy, and other sciences developed. Civilizations rose and fell. Technology advanced from stone to bronze to iron to steel. And then, just in the last few centuries, the pace of change accelerated dramatically. The Industrial Revolution harnessed fossil fuels. Coal, oil, and natural gas formed from ancient plants and plankton. Machines replaced muscle power. The human population exploded from around 1 billion in 1800 to nearly 8 billion today. We have transformed the planet's surface with our cities, our farms, our roads. We have altered the chemistry of the atmosphere by burning those ancient fossil fuels, releasing carbon that had been locked away for hundreds of millions of years. The climate is changing again, warming at a rate faster than any natural change in the past. Species are going extinct at rates not seen since the asteroid impact 66 million years ago. We are living through what some scientists call the sixth mass extinction, and we are its cause. But we are also the first species to be aware of our impact and to have the ability to change course. We can study the past, understand how Earth's climate and ecosystems have changed over billions of years, and use that knowledge to make better decisions about the future. When we look back at Earth's long history, from its violent birth 4.6 billion years ago to the present moment, we see a planet that has continually changed. Continents have drifted, climates have shifted, oceans have risen and fallen, life has evolved and diversified, and sometimes nearly disappeared. Through it all, Earth has endured. Life has proven remarkably resilient, bouncing back from every catastrophe, evolving into new forms, filling every available niche. We are part of that long story, descendants of the first cells that formed in ancient oceans, inheritors of 4 billion years of evolution. As we drift towards sleep, we might reflect on our place in this vast sweep of time. We are the universe becoming conscious of itself, made of atoms forged in dying stars, animated by the same chemistry that began in deep ocean vents billions of years ago. Our moment on Earth is brief, but it is part of an ongoing story. What we do now will echo forward into the future, affecting the planet that future generations will inherit. The history of Earth is not over. It continues, unfolding day by day, shaped by geological forces and by the actions of living things, including us. The planet that formed from dust and violence has become a world of water and life, of blue skies and green forests, of creatures great and small living out their brief spans under the same sun that has shone for 4.6 billion years. And so we rest, here at the end of our journey through time, knowing that we are part of something far larger than ourselves. We are Earthlings, children of this planet, made of its substance, shaped by its history. The story of Earth is our story, and as we close our eyes and let consciousness fade, we carry with us the knowledge of where we came from, how we got here, and the responsibility we bear for where we go next. Sleep well, knowing you rest on an ancient planet that has seen everything and survived. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again, as it has risen every day for billions of years, and the story will continue.